Opera 101 is our Monday through Friday. For all ages, we answer questions and discuss certain aspects of what we do and how the opera industry works. My name is Dean Buck, and I am the assistant conductor and chorus master for Cleveland Opera Theater today, or for Cleveland Opera Theater. And today we are going to talk a little bit about the preparation, the stuff that we do before rehearsals even begin, to put us on the right foot for a successful rehearsal process. Now, for most of us, preparing an opera takes months. There's a lot of music, there's a lot of words, there's a lot of everything, and we need to make sure that we have it all completely set and a game plan together before rehearsals even start. Because as we've talked about before, usually we have to put something like this together in a very quick amount of time, and there's no time at all to play catch up. So from a conductor's perspective, the first thing that we need to do is learn the text of the opera. Typically, the most performed operas are in Italian, French, German, or English. There's a few in Czech, a few in Russian, but the bulk of the standard repertoire is Italian, French, German, English. And so it's required that we have some sort of facility in the language that the opera's in, and that we have a translation. And you need to have a very deep understanding of it, not to the point where you have to check your translation and to figure out what something means. You really need to internalize the text. You need to internalize what it means, how it's said in case a singer asks you. You need to know. You need to know how to coach in that language. It's a very, very important part. Also, operas are pieces of theater. They are dramatic. And if you don't understand exactly the dramatic subtleties, there's going to be no way to show that musically. The music of an opera is completely informed by the drama. So learning that drama, learning that text is exactly the first step. Because if you don't have that, then you can't really understand what the composer's doing. Once you've translated and internalized the text, for me, the next step is learning the harmonies. Because so much of the emotion is in the harmony. Do a harmonic analysis, and after we understand what's happening harmonically, then it's time to learn the vocal parts. And even though I am not a singer, the only way to learn the vocal parts is by singing them and singing them over and over and over again until you basically have them memorized. You need to internalize everyone's part and know every single person's part as well or better than the singer does. Because as a music director, you need to get the singers to perform at their highest level. And if you don't know the parts as well as they do, it's never going to happen. So once we have the text, the harmonies, and and understand the parts, then we can look at the orchestration, which is what the orchestra is doing. Typically, we will know the music and know the melodies, know the harmonies before we look at the orchestration. When we get to this point, this is when we start thinking about practical implications of what we're doing. So, for example, tempo. Composers, especially in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, are not particularly detailed when they give us a tempo indication. Mozart, for example, will often write something like allegro, which literally means happy, but in musical terms is understood to mean upbeat, fast, or something like allegro vivace, fast and lively. This can mean a lot of different things. There's a big window. So how do we find what the right tempo is? Well, first we have to look at the vocal lines. The text needs to be understood, and the singers need to be able to breathe in places that are intuitive with what the text is. You don't want a singer to have to breathe in the middle of a sentence because Mozart was a smart composer. He didn't write it for, so someone would have to do that most of the time. Now, once you look at this, you also have to look at the orchestration. There could be something that's really fast and really exciting, and the singers are able to really spit out the words and go really fast. But then if you look at the orchestration, sometimes, say, the second violins have this incredibly difficult line that you can maybe go so fast for the singers, but if you have especially a pickup orchestra that doesn't have a ton of rehearsal time, you're never going to get to play it that fast with the violins. This is why it's important as a conductor to understand not only the voices, but the instruments in the orchestra, and be able to look at a score and say, that's going to be really hard on this instrument to do it at this tempo. Therefore, we need to maybe dial it back a bit. Sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes you have this really beautiful, slow passage, but you can't take it too slow, or else the singers will completely run out of air before a phrase is over. So these are the things that we need to think about with everything. Once we get an idea of the tempo, then we have to start thinking about the musicality and the phrasing. Where does this go? You can't just sing it all soft, and a lot of composers don't give you every single dynamic. So we have to intuit that a lot. Some of these are bound to change once you get in the room with the singer, and as conductors, we like to collaborate with singers. So if a singer has a really great musical idea that's a little different than ours, great. That's part of the fun, is figuring it out together. However, going in, you need to have an understanding of what are the possibilities. This is a valid possibility, and this is a valid possibility. There could be a lot of valid possibilities, but we need to understand what they are, so we're prepared to adapt if the singer has a very kind of different understanding, and we need to know what the limitations are. If a singer wants to do something so expressive that it's going to maybe just not work with how the orchestra is written, and we just don't have time to go through and explain everything to the orchestra, then we have to figure out a way to compromise. Again, it's usually a very easy process, but personally, and a really fun process. It just really requires that you know what's going to happen beforehand. Another thing that we have to think about beforehand are cuts in the opera. Mozart, Rossini, Donizetti, a lot of those operas are very, very long. Bizet, and there are standard cuts where things are not maybe the most musically interesting, and also are not super necessary to advance the story. This is a long tradition of opera. And even big houses do a lot of cuts in these operas. When you get later, some Verdi is cut a bit, but starting the Verdi, Puccini, it gets a lot harder to do that because the music isn't written in a way that's easily cut. It's numbered where, here's a section, and then there's a recitativo, and then here's another section. So it gets a little more difficult to do that, but especially with the kind of first half of the 19th century and before, Baroque opera is usually quite cut. In order to determine how we do this, it requires a good amount of conversation with the stage director, because the stage director and the music director need to be on the same page as to the dramatic and the musical elements to it. So we usually, the conductor and the stage director have a conversation or a series of conversations and decide, let's just do the standard cuts. Or, maybe, I know this part's often cut, but it's really nice and it kind of adds a different thing. So let's do that and keep the other ones. Or, this one, we do the standard cuts. We still need a little bit more time off. So it's a conversation that we always have. When we get to thinking about the orchestra, this is a part where a lot of preparation is really, really necessary. Typically with Cleveland Opera Theater, we only get about 2 or 3 orchestra rehearsals before we start adding in the singers, in which case we don't have the time to go through in detail and do everything we want. So the more we can do before the rehearsals start, the better. A big thing about this is bowings for the strings. It's really important that the strings are going up bow versus down bow at the same time, and that their bowings are synchronized. So if we can get this done before the first rehearsal and figure it out, that will save us so much time in rehearsal. Typically, the conductor talks to the concertmaster or concertmistress, who is the first violinist, and we figure that out together, along with the principal second violin, the principal viola, the principal cello, and the principal bass. So this is typically a conversation that happens well in advance of the first rehearsal, and we figure out what bowings we want to use and how to do that. Get them in the parts before they're distributed to all the string players. The string players always know from the beginning how we're bowing. Granted, things may change a little bit once rehearsals start, but largely it's taken care of. Also, dynamics. In a lot of operas, the entire orchestra is written mezzo forte, which means medium loud, essentially. This is also very ambiguous, and it's the conductor's job to understand, well, there's a soprano singing in the lower range, which doesn't cut as much. So even though the orchestra is written louder, we're going to need to take the dynamic down to make sure the singer is still able to be heard. Other examples are, okay, the string's written forte, loud, but there's a clarinet solo. The strings are going to need to play a little softer because the clarinet solo needs to be heard. So it's all about figuring out what we can communicate before we even get into rehearsal, putting it in the parts, so we don't have to stop in rehearsal and say that, and can work on more of the more fine musical things in rehearsal. Such other things is the space we're performing in. Certain opera houses have a very, very deep orchestra pit. Certain are very shallow. If the orchestra's further down, the orchestra can play out. They can play louder, but if they're shallow, they run the risk of drowning out the singer, so the dynamics need to be taken down a bit for that. Also, we need to take into account, once the rehearsal process starts, the staging. Where is the singer? If the singer's really far upstage, the orchestra's going to need to play very softly because it's going to be a lot harder for the audience to hear the sound coming from super upstage as if they're further downstage. This is another conversation that we like to have with the stage director, so we can just be on the same page. Mimi has her aria in La Boheme. It's not typically a good stage director will know that she needs to be further downstage so that she can be heard and cut over the orchestra, project over the orchestra. But as a conductor, it's, not a bad idea if you're working with a stage director who maybe they've been a great theater director, but they're just starting to get into opera, just to make sure we're all on the same page. This is what we need to do. Just make sure she's coming down stage for this in something like a Mozart finale, where there's a lot of frenzy going around. The music is also very difficult. So even though it would be really cool to have the singers kind of moving really fast along the stage, they need to be in a place where they can sing together and sing very fast and very difficult music while watching the conductor. This is all things that we do when we talk to the stage director before the rehearsals start about the process. One final thing I'd like to talk about before we hop off is the idea of performance practice versus what's in the score. Typically, a lot of early 19th century, mid-19th century bel canto operas, those by Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini, they are written so that the singer can have a lot of freedom. But what is often done in the tradition of performing these is not what's in the score. What we need to do is figure out which of these traditions we want to adhere to and which of them we want to say, well, it's not written that way, so let's try to do a more faithful performance. Typically with the early bel canto stuff, that's why they were written. They were written so the singers could have freedom, so the singers could show off their vocal ability. But something that would be very appropriate in, let's say, Rossini would not be appropriate in an opera of Verdi. There are varying degrees. Performance practice has changed a lot and has gone through a lot of different phases. So for this reason, I always think when we were learning an opera, we want to stay away from recordings. Once we know it, it's definitely helpful to listen to recordings and hear all these different performance practices. And I think there is something to learn from all of them. no matter if we want to do something completely different than, say, Karajan, or something different than maybe Rene Jacobs. There is something to learn from all of them, and there are interesting things that were done. But we want to make sure we're not learning someone else's interpretation. We want to learn it as the composer wrote it, and then ask ourselves the question, what do we want to do here? How many liberties do we want to take? How much freedom do we want to give the singers? What is appropriate? What is appropriate for what the composer wanted, and also the traditions that have been established? These are all questions that there could be a lot of right answers to. There could also be a lot of wrong answers to, but it's our job to figure it out. And it is one of the most fun parts about being a conductor and being a music director, or being a singer, or being a musician of anything, is to kind of figure out, how is this supposed to go? How much liberty do we take? How much is too much? How much is not enough? These are just a few of the things that we think about going into the first rehearsal, going into the rehearsal process. As always, if you have any questions, or there's any aspect to this that you'd be interested in learning more about, feel free to contact us, email us, and we'd be happy to explain. Thank you, as always, for joining us, and we will see you back here tomorrow.